friends, and welcome. I hope you were here to enjoy the extraordinarily stimulating and educational event with Nicholas Stern and Heather Boucher last night. You heard President Levin introduce Nicholas Stern last night, so I won't repeat his many accomplishments and honors, except to say that he's been working at the highest level of national and international politics for several decades to better the human condition. And I also expect that he's the only person in the room not only to have met many times with Nelson Mandela, but to have had a 5-hour lunch with Fidel Castro. Let me introduce our two discussants for today. Gretchen Daly is Bing Professor of Environmental Science here at Stanford, as well as being a senior fellow of the Woods Institute for the Environment and a courtesy professor at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Gretchen has several hundred scientific and popular articles to her credit, as well as a dozen books. She's a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, and like Nick Stern, the winner of the Blue Planet Prize. She's perhaps best known for being co-founder and faculty director of the Stanford Natural Capital Alliance, a 20-year-old global partnership whose mission is to help secure the well-being of people and nature, and whose approach is now being integrated into policy and practice in over 75 countries worldwide. Simon Caney is professor in political theory at the University of Warwick. He's internationally acclaimed for his many books and papers on our duties across borders, on our responsibilities to future generations, on the nature of our responsibilities to prevent climate change, and on what would be a just transition to a low-carbon world. He's been a member of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics and has written papers for the World Bank, the International Council on Human Rights Policy, Oxfam, and the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice. It's a particular pleasure to have Simon here today. His many publications have become classics in my field of political philosophy and staples on university syllabi around the world. He is simply one of the finest philosophers in the world, and for our topics today, there is no one better to represent a philosophical point of view. Nick will speak for the first 25 minutes, then Gretchen for 15, Simon for 15. The three will be in conversation for 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for general discussion. Please welcome Nicholas Stern.
Thank you so much. I was greatly honored to be asked to give the lectures, and it's a special honor to do that with three such distinguished discussants. So I'm looking forward very much today, and I did enjoy the discussion with Heather yesterday. Yesterday I looked at the science and the technology. Every time you look at the science, it looks more worrying. Every time you look at the technology, it looks more encouraging. And if you put that together with the economics, particularly the economics of investment and innovation and structural change, you get the story which I tried to set out yesterday of the growth story of the 21st century. So there's a very good and attractive way forward, but it is not easy. You have to invest a lot. The political difficulties will be very intense, and the ethical issues we have to think through with care. So this part of of what I have to say is about the ethics and the politics, if you like, based on the moral philosophy and the political philosophy. I will be trespassing a little bit into areas of social science, which are not my first part of my education. I've loved moral and political philosophy all my life, but I've never really practiced it. So I'm, as it were, venturing into new paths, but paths that I've worried about for quite a long time. The way in which I'll try to do it is in these 4 parts. So I'll try to look across the waterfront, set out ethical perspectives rather broadly first and highlight the questions. And if you like, that's going to be mostly about philosophical approaches that point to duties. And then in the second part, I will focus more on rights, in particular the right to development, which I highlighted yesterday. Yesterday was mostly a consequentialist approach, costs and benefits, consequences of actions, evaluated to look at the acceptability of the actions. So most of what I talked about was consequentialist yesterday. I did introduce the rights approach, particularly the right to development, and I'm going to come back to it today. Then I'll speak a little bit about justice, and in many ways I'm a student of Amartya Sen, and that I understand, following his great book, The Idea of Justice, the ability to recognize injustice is a bit easier than the ability to recognize justice, and injustice is essentially a right or an entitlement denied. So thinking about injustice means thinking about what the rights and entitlements are or should be, and what circumstances are they denied. So that I'll speak about there. And then finally I'll come back to the role of the state. And the waves of optimism, which you might have noticed yesterday, when you come back to the politics and the role of the state, those waves are a bit diminished. And I'm enormously optimistic about what we can do and deeply worried about what we will do. I think the human race's ability to miss opportunities is pretty well developed, and we may well miss this one. But our job is to see how we can translate what we can do through our ideas, through our communications, through the way we engage in the politics of it all, how we can turn what we can do into something that's a bit more likely that we will do. I think as academics, communicators, that's a big part of what we should do. So that's what I'll try to do. Now, in this first part, I'm going to, in about 2 minutes each, go through the major philosophies and the major religions. That allocation of time is not a reading of my allocation of the importance of those perspectives. It's that in what I've been trying to do here, I've concentrated on the consequentialist approach, the stock in trade of economics, and I've insisted on the rights to development, which I think of special importance here. But I didn't want to leave those big philosophies and big religions simply unsaid. That would be even more cavalier than trying to do it all in 3 or 4 minutes. So the big philosophical traditions, and my apologies to the philosophers here for the superficiality of all this. But if we think of virtue ethics and what's virtuous behavior, what's good behavior, and we think we have some ability to recognize virtuous or good behavior, I think recklessness with the lives of other people would not count as virtuous. Kant's categorical imperatives, you should do what you would wish all others to do. Well, surely not destroying the environment is what you would wish others to do. So that's what you should do. And so I think it fits very well with the Kantian approach. I've tried this out on the wonderful Onora O'Neill, who's a great Kantian, and Onora thinks it's okay. So if Onora thinks it's okay, it's all right for me. And of course, not treating other people as instruments to trash the environment for future generations does look to me like treating future generations as instruments. And that, again, is not something that I think would fit with that story. If you approach the social contractarian approaches from the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, and if you ask if you did not know what generation you were going to end up in, then you probably would be tempted to look to all generations as thinking about leaving the next generation with something at least as good as they had. So I think at least the Rawlsian version of social contract, I think, would be come through there. I'm less confident about that Habermas approach, where you try to talk it all through together and come to a view, because there are going to be some people in this room or this public square who are going to be pushing their vested interests very, very hard. If your powers of persuasion were strong enough, then perhaps you could bring them around as well. And so that's, broadly speaking, there's a very sort of rag-bag approach of common sense pluralism, where you ask, well, what do people normally think? What do they, if they haven't studied moral philosophy, how do they behave, and what they think is decent things to do. And again, I think trashing the environment for the future generations would not fit in with that. So that's the story. So what I've argued is that if you take the great philosophies, they would point to strong action on climate change. That's important because they are great philosophies and are guides, but it's also important from the point of view of the politics of it all. The more different perspectives take you to the same place, the more chance you have of getting things together. If you look at the great religions, I think the Abrahamic religions, if you look at the way, Pope Francis, of course, the great example of the way in which he has seen Christianity, or at least Catholicism, as taking you, was very clear and strong. And the Laudato Si was an extraordinary document, very deliberately produced just before the Paris Agreement. This was a pope who thought it was his duty to influence the international public discussion. Pope Leo seems to be committed to taking on that tradition. Now, you can see similar strong statements from authoritative positions in Islam and in Judaism. Much of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism are constructed around an idea of the relationship between the individual and the environment, and the duty of the individual to look after the environment, the situation of the individual as actually part of a big environmental story. And if you look at codes of indigenous people, you can see examples in constitutions in essentially Ecuador and Bhutan and Bolivia, where those rights of nature are recognized and cast into the constitution. So if you look again at the major religions, I would hope they pointed in this direction. The Abrahamic religions seem to rely quite a lot on Genesis 2.15, which is that man in the Garden of Eden is there to work it and take care of it. So it's the idea of looking after God's creation. And that very powerful line from Pope Francis, if we destroy creation, creation will destroy us. Now, some of us, including myself, struggle with the concept of creation. That doesn't matter. It's crystal clear what he's saying. And that's an example of very powerful communication based on clear reflection. I've already gone into, this is really just here for completeness in this part of the story. The consequentialist approach was being applied yesterday. Those of you economists who survived the first lecture will recognize that mostly we use social welfare functions which depend on the utilities of the individuals. That's the version of consequentialism that we standardly use. And of course, there's a tighter part of that, which is utilitarianism, where you attach what you think are cardinal expressions of people's utility. And that's the consequentialism. The right to development is, and again, following Amartya Sen expression of that, it's the freedom to pursue a life that one has reason to value. And for Amartya, the right to development and freedom and agency are all part and parcel of the same idea. And for him, the capabilities that an individual have are the means to exercise that agency and that freedom. And I'll go into that in just a little more in a moment. Now, if you have different ethical perspectives, I've argued that mostly they point the same way, but they don't always point the same way. And if you think of a big social cost-benefit analysis which decides that we need a new grid, and that grid will have to go have transmission power cables that go in different ways. They used to be going from the coal-fired power stations, which was where the coal was, and now they're going to be coming from offshore wind or somewhere else. Then you're going to have a new system of transmission lines, and you can produce a very powerful argument that that will give you a much better world or a country or whatever your unit is. But there'll be some people who will have a transmission line running across their land where there wasn't one before, and they feel that they have a right not to be harmed in that way. So the social good from the point of view of the consequentialist framework would be in tension or in conflict in that case with the rights of an individual. And there's no weighting. You can't say, well, I'm going to attach 80% to the consequentialist view and 20% to the rights view. You're not going to work things out that way. That's going to be a political and legal process. And many would argue that someone whose rights are infringed as a result of a decision for the collective good, that we should work out ways of compensation. So, you can buy the land at a good price, or you can say you can have free electricity for the next 10 years. There are all kinds of deals that you can do. But that's, as it were, a political, legal process for resolving a conflict between results that you get from different perspectives. And finally, by way of this introductory bit of what I wanted to say, I'll emphasize what I said yesterday. At least I tried, and we shared it, to identify a way forward, which was about investing in the new to realize a new growth story. We said that was the way forward. That was the way we could rise to the challenge of climate change and produce something that not only stopped the destruction of livelihoods for future generations, but also produced a rather better way of growing and developing across the world, rich and poor countries, over this next 20 or 30 years. And that was the argument I gave. If that seems to be the way forward, there are going to be lots of difficulties in realizing that. So for me, the ethics and the politics are around how do you actually build that broad story up? How do you make it happen? Who does what? Who's responsible for what? But within that big framework. And that's a very different story from saying there's the environment and there's output, and we have to decide how much we value the environment. Now, there'll be lots of choices where the valuation of the environment does indeed matter. But in terms of finding, and Gretchen's done lots of this stuff, but finding a way forward here is actually about getting these investments done in a way that serves as many people as possible, and asking who is going to create the circumstances, who is going to provide the finance. And those are political and ethical questions, and that's what I want to focus on here. But what I wanted to insist on is that your ethical questions arise in the context and are shaped by your technical, economic, scientific, and so on, and social description of the problem. And that's what I've tried to do here. So, rights. I have actually already said quite a bit about that, emphasizing for a US audience, of course, the Declaration of Independence, which surely does embody those ideas pretty strongly. And it actually goes further, and it says it's the duty of the state to create the conditions where those rights do exist and can be exercised. So there's actually in that statement not only the rights of individuals, there's quite a strong statement about the role of the state, which your forebears subscribe to, and I think I would subscribe to that also. There's also the Declaration of the Right to Development from the UN. Again, in a rather strong way, a rather similar spirit. I do note, though, that when that came to the United Nations General Assembly in 1986, there was one vote against and 8 abstentions. There are no prizes for guessing what the one vote against was. This was Ronald Reagan's presidency, and the vote against was the United States. Interestingly, the UK, and shame on us, abstained, along with a few other European countries and Israel and Japan. But that was small. It was 146, I think, in favor. But again, it's a statement of the right to development. It's a statement of, in Sen's language, the right to pursue a life you have reason to value. It's also, and I've already emphasized it, it's also about personal freedom. It's about liberty, clearly in the sense of Isaiah Berlin. The right to development encompasses the right not to be harmed, the negative liberty part of the story. And it also says it's about the freedom to pursue a life. It's the positive liberty as well. And going beyond that, beyond the individuals in society, I think increasingly here, the ideas that we're pursuing in this story, or this new growth story, are really dependent on how communities behave. You can't have public transport other than in a community. You can't reuse and recycle other than in a community. Whole systems of networks, whether they be for electricity or the Wi-Fi or whatever it is, they are about organizing a community. So I do think the notions of civic freedom, the notion of contributive justice, that we were trying to build societies where people have a right to take part in the activities and a right to take part in the decision making. I think that comes through quite strongly when we think about what we have to do in terms of environment and climate. So lots of this is about freedom, but freedom from a number of different key and I think complementary perspectives. Then, having established those basics, I mean, they're not established, of having argued those bases, you accept it or you don't, and that's up to you, but having argued those basics, I've already moved from the right to development of individuals and of the government to provide circumstances where they can be exercised. But then, of course, you have to think about how those rights conflict, and then the rights of others become duties for you, and that you have a duty not to restrict or undermine or destroy the rights of others. So the responsibilities of individuals, responsibilities of governments within that context, and that's all part of the ethics and politics of this very difficult transformation that we're arguing about. This is a reminder from yesterday, so I won't dwell on it, but I'm chair of a global school of sustainability, and you have a school of sustainability here at Stanford. And so we have to try to get some clarity about what it means. And I emphasized yesterday, and I'll do again today, that sustainability is a kind of baseline. You don't want to leave the next generation worse off than this one, but you'd actually rather like to make him better. I gave the example yesterday. Do you just want to leave the appalling air pollution in Delhi the same for your children as it is for you, or would you rather like to bring it down? And that's, I think, where reduce it, and that is, of course, sustainable development versus sustainability. So when I talk about sustainability, I hope generally now to be understood as talking about sustainable development. Justice, as I've already argued following Amartya Sen, is rights denied. Simon knows much more about this than I will ever know, but I think it's very important that we recognize that there will be whole groups who might be liable to suffering injustice as a result of the climate change. It's poor people who get hit earliest and hardest by climate change. It's poor people who've usually contributed less to the creation of climate change. So whole groups see their rights to development damaged by all this. So I think it's helpful to think of when we're talking about justice as not just to individuals, it's that whole groups of individuals will suffer different kinds of injustices. Poorer countries will suffer stronger injustices for the reasons I've just described. And often in terms of extreme events, it's women and children who are most vulnerable. Often women stay longer to try to protect. They don't get out so quickly and so on. So there are whole classes of individuals who suffer injustice, and I think it's very important to think that through. And there's also the role of richer countries in responsibilities to try to sort this out. And they, in the past, have emitted more. They are particularly responsible in that sense for the damage to the rights of development for others. So I think most of us would want to argue that they therefore have a particular role to play in realizing this new form of development. But I do want to emphasize, and I heard it very clearly from Melis Zenawi, this was in 2011. In 2011, in Africa Day, in the COP in Durban, and I was on the panel with him. And this was the sentence. I mean, I wrote it down immediately, and I've never forgotten it. It's not justice to foul the planet because other people have fouled it in the past. And you often hear people saying exactly that because other people grew in dirty ways, so I have a right to grow in dirty ways. Well, no, I don't understand where that right would come from, because it is still doing things that damage the rights to development of other people. So that's, I also wanted to distinguish the right to development and the right to carbon space. There is a literature over the years that speaks in terms of the carbon space. I haven't got time to go into it in great detail, but essentially it says that given how much concentrations there are now in the atmosphere, and given the concentrations which would be consistent with a certain temperature, say 1.5 or 2 degrees, that's the carbon space we've got left. And you then can set up a story that the justice is around the allocation of that carbon space. But that's not the way that I look at it. The right to development is what's at issue here, and the deprivation of the right to development is what we can think of as injustice. So the way I would like to approach it is to ask the question, how can those most responsible for the problems we're in participate and collaborate in ways that will enable those who've been hit particularly hard to grow strongly and find this new form of development. You'll have to give me about 3 more minutes, but you've done your job very, very well. I'll try to be very quick now. There's also a notion of compensation, which I think does have some intellectual attraction. If you've damaged other people, then there's a sense in which you have an obligation to try and rectify the damage that you've done. My worry here is not actually on the ethics, it's on the practicalities and the politics, because it's so difficult to calculate the damage done. A lot of the damage was done by the UK, but my grandparents weren't from the UK. Yeah? You get all sorts of puzzles and difficulties in trying to work out who's responsible for what. And of course, at the time of the Industrial Revolution in the UK, the understanding of the science of climate change was rather limited. Yeah? So it's not that responsibility to compensate is a bad concept. It's that when you try to apply it, it's a very difficult, and particularly in this context, divisive notion. It splits people apart. It creates arguments when what you're trying to do is to create collaboration. So I've already spoken about the role of the state. I haven't got the time to go into it in any detail. Create the conditions for investment. Try to encourage different kinds of behavior. The politics of all this require support within the society. That requires understanding, knowledge, and particularly it requires public discussion. Amartya Sen's emphasised that, Habermas, many others, but I think that's a critical part of the story. And we see in current life, not only in the US, but also elsewhere, the difficulties of having that public discussion. I don't think the response to that to say, well, it's all too difficult, it's impossible, we can't have a public discussion. It's our job to try to contribute and create that. So that's the end of what I want to say. I try to argue that there's an economic, ethical, and political imperative to pursue this new story of growth and development. I've argued that the economics has to be oriented in a much more structural, dynamic way that looks and examines a whole range of market failures. It's got to think about immense risk. The ethics that I've emphasized, you've got to start with the logic of the problem before you can start assembling the ethics. I've emphasized consequentialism and rights and justice, and now in a very rapid way gone through other philosophies. But here we have a very interesting state of affairs where the self-interest of a lot of countries and their ethical obligations actually align. And that's something which we have to try to make the best of in trying to get to actions. Finally, on the politics and the political economy, this is going to be hard. The idea that there's a new path we can follow, I find very convincing. The idea that it's going to be easy for that to come about, I do not find very convincing. But therein lies our job. Our job is to turn something which we can see as possible but difficult into something that can actually be the case. The alternative is something that is much more difficult, and that's to do nothing. And that's the most difficult path of all, because it is so destructive. Thank you. Thanks.
It's really, oops. Is this a good volume? Okay. It's really fabulous to be here. Thank you so much, Professor Stern, and for coming from so far and joining us and opening up this discussion. I really appreciate everyone here as well, and the McCoy Center for hosting us, and the other speakers, Heather, Simon. So in diving in, I'd love to know how many people here are ecologists or biologists. Fantastic. And how many people here are in economics? Great. And how many are more in, say, engineering? Okay, fantastic. There are many other subjects, but many hands went up, and I'm going to try to dive in, opening 3 points to help us open up a conversation together on how to propel the change that we need, what we can do here in more of an academic context where we're actually rubbing shoulders, and what we can do out in the world to help propel the inspiration of people like Amartya Sen, like Pope Francis, and many others who have at least awakened some to the absolute necessity and the opportunity to drive change. And so in opening the 3 points, I guess the first I'd like to state is, and just to keep myself on track, I sort of thought of 87 points to play back on with the conversation yesterday evening and then today. But to stick to these 3 and have you help me do so. The first is that economic systems and our mainstream systems of decision-making are utterly blind to nature. Nature barely figures into any of them in any significant way, and that I see as a core and fatal flaw that we have very little time to fix. And so I'll dive into that question then of, well, how to fix this fatal flaw. And second, the pathways that are being pursued now are twofold, and I'll describe them briefly. And maybe you'll see many other pathways, but I will focus first on more of a technical pathway, or more of a systems change pathway that's been thought through in terms of strategically integrating values of nature into certain parts of decision-making systems that would then, in a hopefully catalytic way, open up further change and lead to real transformation. And then the second pathway is one I'm just kind of reconnecting with myself, I confess, and I would love to connect more with others working on this pathway, relating more to ethics, to justice, and this pathway, I think of it in terms of stewardship, but very much also in terms of rights of nature. What are the rights of nature, and how can we possibly develop and implement a system to enforce them or cultivate them? And then rights to nature are coming up more and more in different countries. And then related to that, just love of nature. I feel ultimately this second path of transformation has to come through the heart and through the spirit, maybe more than through logic and argumentation and policy and such. And I see that a little bit as a mother and thinking about how my kids experience the world as compared to my generation and those before me. So those are the three realms I'd like to open up just briefly. On the first one, just how tragic it is that economics and our decision-making systems are blind to the values of nature. It's most people have no idea how utterly dependent we are on nature. There's so many, and the ways we are, I think of them as little miracles. They're actually, as a biologist, just really fun to learn about and talk about. And I don't know how many of you are enjoying the coffee over there, but just thinking about coffee, for example, it's incredible how dependent coffee production is on rainforest, or how much of boost rainforest gives to farmers whose operations are near it. Anybody know why? I see I have one star student here in the class, so she's not allowed to answer, but how would coffee be dependent on rainforest? Well, one odd and interesting thing about coffee, but true of many, many crops actually, so not that odd, is that it flowers only for about a week per year. And that 1 week out of the whole year, if you're in a coffee production landscape, it looks like popcorn has just exploded all over the place. These beautiful white blossoms just suddenly appear and dominate the entire scene. Looking over hills of, normally verdant green, suddenly they're bursting in white. And so what has to happen in that 1 week? Bees have to show up and do their little job. How many types of bee are there out in coffee landscapes? Anybody want to make a guess? In this one landscape where I've worked for about 30 years in the south of Costa Rica, in a mountainous area at about 4,000 feet elevation, very, very beautiful. We've, within 1 month, discovered about 700 different types of bee. And it's just millions or billions or trillions of bees out. Nobody's measured the numbers of bees, really. We know they're going down. But over 700 types out there, and how do you figure out what they're all doing? There's some wonderful people who've worked on all that for a while, but to summarize just a tiny bit of the story briefly, it's that those bees, they rely for 51 weeks of the year on the forest near the coffee. And that's what enables them to be sitting there kind of in waiting to come out and then make the most of the coffee bloom when it happens, and increase yield and productivity and income of farmers and our enjoyment of coffee. And then if we look below ground, next to nothing is known. It's incredible. Anybody want to guess how many organisms are in a pinch of soil? Just a pinch of soil, maybe in that patch of rainforest or in the coffee. It's billions. And over half of life is thought to be in soil, of the many different life forms. And 99% of these life forms are thought to be unknown. We know there's a ton of bacteria down there and other microbes, miles of fungal filaments connecting and transmitting all kinds of information, as well as what ultimately is the food of the system. And that obviously is also crucial. Let me touch on one other way of coming at this. It's just think about health, human health in urban systems. So we're leaving the beautiful verdant hills and mountains of Costa Rica. Imagine, a really big city, or even a place just right around here, Silicon Valley, let's say, the whole Bay Area, the developed parts. It's now been discovered that mental health is very sensitive to exposure and experience of nature. Even small elements of nature can have a really dramatically positive effect, which is a great thing. So for example, some decades back, a famous study was published in Science showing that recovery from an operation, in this case it was gallbladder surgery, won't go into the details, but a very kind of well-controlled experiment. People got to recover in one of two types of room in the same hospital. One type of room looked out on a nice brick wall of the adjacent part of the building. The other type of room looked out on literally one tree. And the people in the rooms with the view of a tree recovered more quickly, with less pain medication, and with fewer complications than people looking out on, it wasn't a bad wall, it was just, there was no tree there. And a student of mine from a while back, who's now a senior professor at University of Washington, Greg Bratman, he and some others here in psychology and we launched an experiment that involved looking at mental health. And if you have all hopefully taken in the beautiful view behind us of Lagunita and the hills, so we have people walk. We basically go for a walk. And first, though, they had to, and it was right out this area, or down on El Camino, the busy street. Hardly a megacity street, but a fairly busy street. There are trees along it, but maybe hard to focus on those trees while traffic is rushing by. We had them take some cognitive functioning tests and emotional well-being tests prior to going on the walk. And then they were driven with the Marguerite shuttle, for all those who are from here, in a very standardized way, either to El Camino or up here, and then asked to walk for 50 minutes. We gave them little phones so we could track what they were actually doing and all that. And the people who walked up here had dramatically better cognitive functioning, all kinds of tricky tests that psychologists have developed to befuddle people, you know, and testing working memory and ability to reason or to inhibit impulses, all kinds of stuff. And they had let go of ruminating, that thing everybody seems to do of sort of kicking oneself for a dumb decision or some regretted moment in the past. And they were just thinking nice thoughts about, you know, away from their personal self. So I bring all this up just to emphasize how powerful and yet how subtle, how powerful the effects of nature are, and yet how subtle are the natural systems that generate them. So how do we possibly transform economic decision-making and other mainstream forms of decisions to integrate this subtlety? That's what the Natural Capital Alliance has been up to, propelled by friends who are part of the Alliance who got going a decade or so earlier, back, say, in the 1990s. And the idea was to, just as for carbon, which is complicated as all hell, but much easier in a way, you've got certain metrics like degrees Celsius warming or amount of greenhouse gas emissions being produced each year and that sort of thing. What we've tried to do is develop a systematic approach to characterize human dependence on nature and interdependence with nature. And that is through just measuring all these different goods and services that are delivered through, you know, living around, stewarding, and designing our world with nature in it. So this has been done through partnership, through a lot of innovation, thank you, through producing tools. So we've developed a software system with the data behind it called Invest that lets you map out and shine a light on the nature in any place, in landscapes, coastlines, seascapes, and the flow of benefits that humanity depends on from these different parts of Earth's surface that are providing these benefits. And then we've seen this taken up through partnership in really dramatic ways all around the world. We've worked in about 75 countries directly, and some of them have absolutely taken off with this. And I'll touch on China because in conversation with Nick that we might open up more, China has stood out on the technical side of addressing climate change. It's also really at the forefront in many ways of driving implementation. So they've now zoned 54% of their land surface for revitalizing of nature and have many policies and investments in place to do that. They have the highest reforestation rate in the world. They did that after tasting severe disaster and learning the hard way, but now really stand out. They've developed a new metric called gross ecosystem product that hinges on this, is calculated via this whole framework and suite of models to show how much forest provides not only bees for our coffee, but also flood protection, cooling, carbon sequestration, obviously, just a huge suite of benefits. And I'm going to close by touching maybe on San Antonio, Texas, where you might think this is one of the last places where we'd see a shining example. But the city of San Antonio, a few years ago, through some really interesting leadership and engagement with communities in the flood zones of the city that are basically derelict, these several acre little plots of land along the San Antonio River that frequently and ever more frequently is flooding. They've developed a vision of converting those areas into food forests, so native trees that native people used and cultivated and interlived with, and also sort of urban farms. And these have been adopted, and now the city is really keen in this after a bright success in one case to improve access to food in these food deserts in the cities, improve flood protection, improve cooling so that kids could actually get outside and play, kids that otherwise it's so hot there in summers, never get out. Just open up a green space to promote community as well as individual mental health and physical well-being. And then obviously it ties to carbon, and maybe I'll close on that one and open up the questions more on ethics and stewardship later, but closing and linking back to what Nick Stern has opened up here, we have an urgent need to bring nature in its full glory much more meaningfully into kind of an integrated approach of addressing climate and nature for a much brighter and much more just world. So thank you very much.
I'm going to adjust this. Okay, I need to figure out whether I've got to have my reading glasses on or the ones I can see you. So I can't actually see you, but I can see this. So yeah, I'd like to begin by thanking Leif and the other members of the organising committee for inviting me to comment on one of Professor Stern's Tanner lectures. I'd like to thank the McCoy Family Centre for Ethics in Society for hosting it and for all they've done to make this extremely enjoyable and smooth visit. And thanks very much to Sabrina for all her logistical work. And thanks especially to Professor Stern for two engaging and illuminating lectures. I started work on climate change and justice in about 2004, and the Stern Review came out shortly afterwards, I think 2006. It played such a momentous role in the evolution of people's reflections on climate change and the ethical issues raised in it. So it's a real privilege to be able to comment on your work. So yeah, I'm a political philosopher, and I thought it might be useful just to begin by framing some of the questions that philosophers ask about climate change, and just to bring out the ethical dimension. So one question is, what is wrong or bad about climate change and biodiversity loss? What reasons do we have to care about the natural world? For climate change, another ethical question is, what's the right climate target? For many years, people said it was 2 degrees, and then after Paris, people said well below 1.5. But the science won't give us an answer to that. All these answers rest on some value judgments. And one value judgment on which they rest is, what kind of world do we owe future generations? What are our responsibilities? What kind of world should we leave behind? These are all ethical questions. Another ethical question is, how should we take into account risk and uncertainty? Because all the projections about climate change, biodiversity loss, come in the form of probabilities or risks and uncertainties. So we need to think how we reflect ethically on those. Who has the responsibility to ensure the appropriate measures are taken? What is a just transition? What's the moral significance of the past? So do current members of a society have duties in virtue of the harmful environmental effects of the activities of their predecessors? So these are all kind of ethically fraught questions, and I think one immensely attractive feature of Professor Stern's work that he's been presenting here is just how many of these it touches on and addresses. And I think there's a very attractive idea, for example, of intergenerational justice, what we owe future generations. There's a very attractive notion of rights at the core of it, the idea of a right to develop. And I think the methodology is exactly right, to try and bring together ethics, economics, and also try and draw on different ethical traditions from across the world. I have a problem here in that there's a lot I agree with, and that would be super boring for the rest of you. So what I want to do in the rest of my allotted time is just kind of float 5 or 6 questions that I think would be worth exploring further. And I want to begin with the way that Professor Stern frames the issue as we have like a consequentialist approach, and then it needs to be supplemented and combine another approach oriented around rights. And my first question really is whether the approach developed is in fact an alternative to a consequentialist approach, or is actually another kind of consequentialism. So for the philosophers in the room, this is going to be maybe more of interest than to other people, but I think it matters for reasons I'll spell out. So why do I ask this question? Well, so Professor Stern draws, and by the way I do too, on Amartya Sen's work on rights, and in particular the right to develop. The way that Sen thinks about the right is as a goal. He endorses what he calls in Rights and Agency a goal rights system. Rights, I'm quoting, rights are included among the goals incorporated in the evaluation of states of affairs, and then apply to the choice of actions through consequential links. So this is quite an unorthodox notion of rights. It contrasts with other ways of thinking of rights where they are like what Robert Nozick calls side constraints. They're like blocks on action. For Nozick and others, they're not goals. But for Sen, they are goals. And then I think, well, given that, what we're being offered is not an economic consequentialist approach and then a non-consequentialist one. We're giving a welfarist economic consequentialist approach and another consequentialist approach whose goal is promote the realization of rights. And this is not an objection. It's more, I think, just to ask whether that's right as a description. And I suppose it raises the question for me, but are there other non-consequentialist values that matter that haven't thus far been included? And I will come back to that. So that's my first question. Here's a second question. So I do think that the idea of a right to develop is immensely attractive and appealing, and I think it has all the features that Professor Stern attaches to it. I'm curious, though, how we would enumerate it. So at one point, Professor Stern says it's composite in nature. That is, it's composed of other rights, so that the right not to be deprived of food, the right not to be deprived of drinkable water, the right not to have your health damaged. Many other rights, maybe the right to property, not have your property destroyed by freak weather events. It has political rights, rights of inclusion. But there's another one I wanted sort of draw attention to that hasn't been mentioned, which is what about people's rights to land, the rights to occupy the land in which they work and develop, and for Indigenous peoples may play a central part in their way of life. And the reason I think it might be helpful to spell out and enumerate some of these rights is because if they are included, and I think they should be, they'll have implications for what we ought to do to decarbonize the economy. Because I suppose there are many concerns that renewable energy can be developed in ways that infringe on these rights. So there are concerns that biofuels can sometimes lead to land grabs and dispossession, that lithium extraction in, let's say, the Atacama Desert may deprive local communities of access to water, or lithium extraction in Nevada, in, I think it's called Thacker Pass, involves violating the rights of Indigenous peoples to land that they lay claim to. Think of wind farms in, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in northern Mexico, where Indigenous peoples are being displaced from the land for the creation of wind farms. Now, if you think, well, the right to develop does include other things like the right to land, what this would mean is there's a very weighty pro tanto reason not to pursue these projects in ways that infringe on these rights. And so the second point I'm trying to make then is the fuller the description of what the right includes, the clearer sense we can get of what compass we can use when thinking about decarbonizing the planet, and certain courses of action may be ruled out. And that leads on to a third question. I realize because I've got this, I can't actually see the time monitor, which is like an asset for me, but not for you. But if you can wave when I'm... So here's the third issue, which is, as Professor Stern has said, sometimes there will be cases where there might be a conflict between pursuing a goal like decarbonizing and someone's rights. And at one point, you said there's no algorithm and just kind of resolve this, and I think that's right. But I did actually think that there's a compact, but I thought extremely rich passage in the paper, which gave us the materials from which to generate a fuller account. And I think just drawing on what was said, someone might think, look, there is actually a good ethical framework we could construct here. So the principles that one could perhaps derive are, first, let's think those examples I talk about renewable energy. You could ask, has there been free, prior, and informed consent by the affected parties, which is a sort of a common framework from the UN, amongst others. Secondly, is there a necessity? So must there be lithium extracted here? Must lithium be extracted at all? Could we do other things like reduce demand for batteries for cars? Are there other materials that could be used? So another condition then is necessity. A third condition, which I think is in the paper, is proportionality. So are the gains from using this sufficient to justify overriding some people or infringing some people's claims? And then maybe two others. One, again, I think was in the paper, but I just wanted to sort of extract it, was equitable benefit sharing. So if people are being deprived of access to something, it seems fitting and appropriate that if like cheap energy is being produced, that they should get privileged access to it or beneficial rates. And then here's another one, which I want to call fairness, which is it might matter a lot on whom the burden is being placed. Is it a wealthy community of high-emitting individuals who have contributed greatly to the problem? Or is it a poor, marginalized community that contributed least and being yet again suffering the brunt of power politics? That's not to do with burden sharing, it's just to do with maybe some people are more liable to bear burdens than others. So I don't think this is an algorithm, but I think drawing on what has been in the paper and maybe adding to it, there are ways of thinking about this that would appeal to, just to repeat, free, prior and informed consent, necessity, proportionality, fairness, fair benefit sharing. So I'm kind of offering this or putting it forward and interested to see what you think and what others would think about. Is this a helpful way to negotiate these tensions? And then, the next question I wanted to ask was, so we have an economic consequentialist framework. We have a rights-based framework. I wondered whether there was another element that I thought was present in the presentation, but it's distinct and maybe worth highlighting, which I'm going to call the fairness complaint or the injustice complaint. So many environmental activists and many representatives from the Global South will say, yes, it impedes development, but it's not just that. What we have is an asymmetric system where there are economic and energy systems in which some people have designed it in ways such that they harvest the benefits. So they've disproportionately contributed to the problem. They disproportionately enjoy the benefits. And then the harms and the burdens are borne disproportionately by other groups. And that's a fundamentally distributive objection. It's not about the level of development. It's more schemes of social cooperation should operate with a spirit of reciprocity or of fairness, and one where this is asymmetric, where I will monopolize the benefits, but I will foist the harms on others, violates that. So I wondered if, I think that's a value that's present in there, but it goes beyond maybe sen and rights, and maybe could be given more of a place, because I do think that's a non-consequentialist consideration that animates many people. So I think that's like 4 questions or queries. I have 2 more. I'm looking at you. So I'm okay for time, am I? Is that 1? Okay. Well, I'll make it super quick then. So I am like almost 100% on board with everything said about the right to develop and the relation with the right to emit. But I wondered whether we have to be a little bit careful saying there is no right to emit whatsoever. Because someone might say, what about someone who's locked into a carbon-intensive way of life, and if you gave them renewables and other ways, they'd love it. But they, to use a phrase in the paper, they lack appropriate support. Others haven't enabled them to do this. So they might say there's a remaining carbon budget, really small, but there's a remaining carbon budget. And although it's technically possible for them to enjoy a good standard of living in a carbon-free way, it's actually not possible for them because others are not providing the support. And so where the support is absent, I wondered whether you might think in those cases some people do legitimately have a right to emit. It should be short-term, transitional, but I suppose I'm slightly uncomfortable thinking, no, they don't have a right to emit. Or can the taxi driver taking me tomorrow drive me to the airport? Because if they are driving a car without that, then what's the implications? Okay, so just the very, very final one was about historical responsibility. And I take it the main concern is in claims for compensation, people will say, you've caused the problem, you should pay the bill. And the objection to that is that it's very divisive and it will result in deadlock. And that's a pretty powerful argument. The thing I worried about, though, was whether that was too powerful an argument, because there were other parts where appeal was made to people's historical record, where I think the the paper wrote, because of their past emissions, rich estates bear a responsibility. And so I thought if it was a good argument against appealing to compensation, maybe it was too good an argument, because people will say, I deny that we have a greater responsibility for the historical record. I wasn't born in the 19th century or early 20th century. I was excusably ignorant. So I think what we needed there maybe is like an explanation as to why it was a good argument against compensation claims. But we could still say the things that I think we should say and that you say about other cases. So that's the question there. So no answers from me, just a series of questions and invitations for more elaboration. Thank you very much.
Oh, you should be in the
No, I'll go here.
Okay. Thank you. That was great.
Is there anything you'd like to start off responding to?
Yes, I enjoyed the last half hour enormously, and I learned so much. And a few very quick responses. I used the language climate almost throughout what I was saying yesterday and today. But when I write about this, I try at the beginning to say I'm talking about climate and biodiversity loss, and we have to think about them together. It's not because they're the same thing. They're not the same thing, but they're very powerfully related. A lot of the things which damage climate through emissions also damage biodiversity. The factors which lead to these problems are factors which affect, most of the factors affect both of them. And of course, a deteriorating climate damages biodiversity, and a deteriorating biodiversity damages climate. So they're these very powerful interrelationships. But they're not the same thing. And it's important to remember that. And the idea of the biome and that we are, as it were, all living in and all dependent on the natural capital and the world we live in is a more powerful idea than the climate. It encompasses all of that. The advantage of talking about climate is what Gretchen said. It's much easier to be specific, and because it is a more simple idea, and you can measure carbon emissions and so on. It doesn't mean it's more important, but for me, if you can make a lot of progress on the climate front, and as you do it, be deeply aware of what you're saying about biodiversity, then you're also making progress on biodiversity. You make more progress on biodiversity if you're looking at climate, if you're aware about it when you do it. And that's a key part of climate policy. And looking back, and I think you know Nicola Ranger, who works on the natural capital side with us at LSE. She put the Stern Review and the recent book into ChatGPT and looked for the mentions of biodiversity. And there was not much mention of biodiversity in the Stern Review, and shame on me, but there was much more discussion of biodiversity in the recent book. And I think that's been a result of Gretchen and colleagues working away and showing in a very powerful way, and the examples were actually both telling and moving that you brought to the table, of how all this starts to fit together, and we've got so much more to understand. And your work, Gretchen, is making it much easier to be quantitative about the natural capital side of the story than we could be 10, 15, 20 years ago, and that's a tremendous contribution. On what Simon said, most of my reaction is that these are indeed important questions, But it'd be interesting, and we can't talk about them all. I absolutely take the point about a kind of welfarist consequentialism and a rights consequentialism, and I'm very comfortable with Amartya's descriptions. And I bristle a little bit about the Nozick story, because if they're constraints, they're constraints. Well, they're not actually constraints, because you can breach them. The question is, under what circumstances would you breach them, and by how much? And I thought the criteria that you set out for thinking about those things, I think, are really helpful. And as you said, it's not an algorithm, but it's a clear set of guiding principles, which I do think we're going to learn about those a bit like case law. We're going to learn about them when we practice them. And you can't practice them in an explicit way unless you think through what they are. Yeah. And I thought that was particularly helpful. And what I've tried to do is to tell a story of a way forward where those conflicts, excuse me, it's all this wonderful spring weather and all these fabulous blossoms coming out. Anyway, I try to tell a story where you've got a whole strategy for development, which you can describe and think about, where actually these conflicts are going to be far fewer than they would if you approached it in another way. So if you have a broad strategic approach, you're not avoiding these things. They're really going to be there. You gave examples, I gave examples. But if we can get a path to development which is positive for far more people, positive in relation to the environment, in relation to the future generations, we're going to have some big choices within that story, but they're going to be far less difficult and violent than if we pursued a different route. And that is, in many ways, what attracts me to the... it's not that it removes the ethical difficulties, they don't arise in quite such a virulent way if you've got a good way forward.
Yeah, great.
But thank you again. I really, it's really nice to sit and listen and learn something. Thank you.
Yeah, so can I maybe pick up on that? So, yeah, I think one thing that's very attractive about your vision, and I hope it's right, is that it's a positive sum situation, and so then a lot depends on that, and I suppose a lot then depends on the politics, and whether the benefits are not going to be just disproportionately retained by some, and maybe just political issues to do with trust, whether people will trust the political institutions to share the benefits so that all can. But I think it's actually one major lesson about legitimation is that if you have a positive sum economy, it makes legitimizing decisions immensely easier and less, as you say, less virulent. The conflicts are less virulent. So yeah, no, I agree with that, but I hope you're right on the empirics.
Okay, we should talk a little bit more about rents and compensation, and the compensation story. I think we can understand its ethical attractiveness, and that was no part of my argument that said that the argument of compensation is flawed as an ethical argument. It's just so difficult when we're trying to bring people together. And so if you can say we have this way forward, it's about investment. It's about investment and innovation in the developing world, because that's where the big growth of emissions would otherwise come. So that past historical responsibility should be recognized, because it is one. You have damaged the rights to development of poorer nations with the dirty path of growth that we followed as rich nations. How then should that responsibility be exercised? And what I've tried to argue is that responsibility should be exercised through collaboration in fostering those investments, most of which will be, just looking at the numbers, in developing countries. So how can you do that? A lot of it will be about finance. That doesn't necessarily mean aid. The aid story has collapsed miserably in the last few years around the rich world. But if you do that through the international financial institutions, through development banks in countries, and you bring down the cost of capital, then you greatly enable those investments to be made. If you have structures where the risks from the investments are reduced, then the private sector is much more likely to make them. So there is a historical responsibility. If you exercise it through compensation, you lead to divisiveness and quarrels. If you exercise it in this other way, you lead to, you know, what you've called the positive sum outcome. On the rent side, sunshine is much more democratic than and equally distributed. It's not equally distributed, but it's more democratic and more equally distributed than oil rents. And oil rents are so focused on narrow groups and so big, so that the incentive to defend them fiercely is so strong, that they're enormously corrosive to collaboration and life. And so I think it's delightful, really, and cheering that the sunshine is most places, but actually this finally is good luck for those nations which have been poor. The nations of the Sun Belt, on the whole, have been poor nations, not everywhere, but mostly. But now there's this tremendous resource which, through much better solar and so on, that they have.
Right. Yeah.
I guess a big question is how to propel action. We keep coming to that there are a lot of good things happening, but they're not happening quickly enough. One thing we've found is that a focus on nature can help a lot in accelerating acceptance and adoption of climate action as well. And it's partly in developing countries. Often it's easier to see an immediate return. Investing in nature, it could be reforesting or protecting forests, but a lot of other ways of improving security along coastlines through protecting and restoring mangroves.
Yeah.
For example, there's an immediate and local return that people experience there, and there's usually many dimensions to it. When you replant or conserve forests, say, you get a huge range of benefits. In the context of mangroves, it would be improving aspects of food security, because a lot of little baby fish are nurtured in the roots of mangrove systems, and also water security. If you have forest upstream, you're protecting the quality and timing of flow of water into downstream areas that need it for hydropower, irrigation, or drinking. You're helping to protect health in many ways. And so people value the immediacy, the local nature, the multidimensionality of the benefits, and also don't feel so much like they're just offsetting the rich polluters who are taking advantage of their weaker political situation.
Yeah.
So we've seen, just to maybe turn a question to you on the deeper ethical shifts that we need. We've seen many places starting to elevate and kind of revitalize dimensions of culture that really connected kids and all people to local aspects of nature. And I wondered, when we think about implementing any of the rights or dimensions of justice that you talk about, how do you cultivate those things? It seems my naive, just being a person, angle on it is there needs to be love. It needs to be through the heart, and it needs to be through kind of some intimate awareness of something. It could be a relationship with just even a pet or a frog outside, or a certain a place that people have as really significant in their family line or something. But in China, for example, just to go again with the one case, they've launched this effort to transform into an ecological civilization. And it does involve trying to reawaken deeper parts of the culture, and then work along many different paths to bring nature into the forefront of thinking. I just wondered if how you would connect philosophical and ethical dimensions to the day-to-day, and what we can do to help cultivate the values that are inherent in the rights and justice.
Do you want to go first? No, I'd say something, but after you.
Well, one thing I didn't ask, but it does very strongly relate to this, was the very first part of your presentation today, where you talked about other ethical worldviews and indigenous peoples, and it made me think that they have a different perspective often than that captured by standard economics, and also by standard discussion of rights and justice. It's much closer to the kind of ethos you were describing then, and I wondered whether, how far you were willing to go with what you said in that first section, and maybe we need to rely more on that than we've hitherto thought, that so people might not really get that motivated by thoughts over this will be economically optimal, or this is required to realize justice. It needs something more powerful in the kind of the realm of what Gretchen was saying.
I think that's right, and that leads you directly to asking where those values and how they arise, how respect for nature comes about. Surely teaching and experience are part of that story, and I'm sure there are some people from South Asia in the audience, but my wife Sue and I have spent a lot of our last 50 years in India, and what children learn about in the sacred Hindu texts is absolutely infused everywhere about forests and animals, and that's a big part of the story, in a way which I think some of the Western religions, of course, some of it's there, but it's not everywhere as it is in those nations. Obviously, in indigenous people, probably even more strongly. So, asking where those values, respect and love, comes from, how does it arise, is a part of the story. One of the problems is if you do it that way, you get very action-oriented. These are the inputs, and you've got to have other inputs into those inputs, and you sort of lose the spirit of the thing if you're not careful. But it does seem to me that the anthropologists and psychologists have got a tremendous amount to contribute to understanding how those belief systems arise, and of course how they can be looked after. And then who does the looking after? Well, it's surely the people with the belief systems, not somebody else coming along and looking after them for you. So those are really big challenges, but you were describing examples of people who spend their time in nature, develop that. It's not that they've automatically got loads of it and they go out and use what they've got. There must be a sort of a two-way street there between your involvement taking you still further and more deeply into the story. It looks like that's happened to you in many ways. Yeah.
I see a gentleman lurking behind you, so I won't respond directly. But
we'd now like to invite you to become part of the conversation. You'll see there's a microphone there and a microphone there. If you have something to say, please line up, and in spirit of fairness to other people, maybe even love, could you please confine yourself to one brief question or comment? Chris, would you like to start?
Thanks so much. I'm really inspired at the concept of sustainable development as a pathway to solving the climate crisis, and at the prospects for that as a mechanism for building wealth around the world. But we face a wide range of challenges where increasing wealth leads to increasing consumption. In addition to a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis, we have a broader consumption crisis. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how to think about the guardrails to ensure that the flowering that comes from the new technology to address the climate crisis doesn't result in consumption so massive that it depletes quality of life around the world.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. For me, what is of overwhelming importance in the next 20 years or so is to change the relationship between consumption and production on the one hand and environmental destruction on the other. You know, just in the crude, I'm going back to the crude climate numbers, you know, we're between 55 and 60 gigatons of CO2 equivalent a year in terms of emissions. And we've got to get that down to net zero as quickly as we can, ideally in 20 years, although that's going to be a hard ask. You don't do that by just crashing consumption. The big numbers, the really big numbers, are going to come from changing the way that you do it. And waste is stupid. I mean, so reducing the waste coming from consumption and production, that, you know, we might get 20% there or some number like that. And it would be absurd not to try to find that and to do that. But to go down to zero is going to involve radical change in the way we do things. And that radical change in the way we do things is going to require investment in different ways of doing things. So I keep coming back that if you look at the next 20 years, which are so decisive, the big priority is investing in the new. And that enables us to cut waste, it enables us to run down the old. And I think the contribution of, quotes, reduced consumption to what we need to do is bound to be modest. So it's not going to really get at the big part of the problem, although it can contribute a bit. On the other hand, if you say, look, I'm at LSE and you're at Stanford and we've done our homework and we realize that all these rich countries, they've just used it all up. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen from the developing part of the world, there ain't no room for you, so you've got to cut your consumption. Maybe we'll cut our consumption a bit, but most important is you cut yours. I mean, I exaggerate for effect,
Sure.
But the politics of that story, I think, are deeply difficult. And the politics of the other way, which says, look, there's these great ways of doing things, we'll cut waste along the way and so on. The politics of that are more attractive, and I think the outcomes are more attractive in short period. That doesn't mean growth forever. I mean, that's a different idea, yeah.
Can I just comment maybe briefly on it? So when I was a student, I remember reading works by I think, Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris, no, especially Ronald Inglehart actually, saying there'll be an evolution of post-materialist values when people got wealthy enough they would. And then going further back, John Stuart Mill in Principles of Political Economy sort of said there's going to be a stationary state, but not to worry, because people would focus more on the art of life and the art of living than on the art of getting by. And then John Maynard Keynes in The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren did the same thing. And so now I think a lot depends on whether they're right, and the evidence doesn't look like it's very much in their favor, right? So I suppose my reflection on it is, and I'm a philosopher who thinks about these things, who tries to keep up with the empirics, but it seems a lot does depend on the social determinants of things like consumption, and that picture from Mill to Keynes to the post-materialist kind of one. If that's true, that's great, but the evidence does not look like it's pointing in that direction. So I'd like to know what does.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm Keitaro from Stanford MBA student. I would like to ask the relationship between biodiversity and economics and local indigenous communities. Professor Stern, you argued about economic tipping point in energy in your books, like moment when clean technology became cheaper to accelerate the private investment in that area. And my question is, like, how biodiversity conservation can reach a similar tipping point, where preserving the nature becomes more economically, attractive than destroying it. It's relating to Gretchen's, analogy or example, but like, what is necessary to achieve it, and how can we collaborate with local indigenous community to achieve it?
It's for you, Gretchen, I think, really.
Okay, that's the heart of the problem, I feel, and you've expressed it very well. And I guess this is where I've thought maybe there are these two tracks. So one track being more focused on systems change involves finding places in the economic and other decision-making systems that have huge influence on how capital is allocated and things like, an example is just looking at how investment is made in development, in the name of development, however sustainable it is or not. There are these credit ratings for countries, and they don't factor in the values of nature. And that means that countries that are being encouraged to wipe out the last bit of nature to fuel unsustainable growth, they're actually getting riskier and riskier as places to lend, and that's not being accounted for. So one focus of the system that people are trying to change now is in assessing the resilience of countries in economic and other terms based on their natural capital. And there are other parts of the system as well where if you bring the values of nature in and make them visible, you see a totally different picture than you see otherwise. And I'll give one other example. It's if you apply gross ecosystem product, you illuminate, first of all, that shows for any given region how much nature is generating goods and services of different sorts. And you see a country totally differently if you actually illuminate where the different types of security are coming from, and you see the interdependence. So far, this has just been done really within countries for political kinds of reasons. But you see how interdependent we are, that actually, if you had the coffee here, obviously it flew here from some tropical location, but it was produced with water from a national park, Yosemite, one of the oldest parks officially in the world. And so if we had more awareness of these interconnections, as we would get through calculating something like gross ecosystem product, and it's a very visual kind of metric, we would also see, I think, other parts of the system changing. And we're seeing that happen there are about 10 countries that are adopting GEP right now, including India, China, several in Latin America, several in other parts of Asia, and some in Africa. So I feel just shining a light on things is step one, and second, focusing carefully on intervening in systems where we have relationships and ability to change. And then third, though, I keep thinking we can't just put off till later this question of how to reignite a deep sense of connection and love for nature that we still see some even in urban populations where kids all have a stuffed animal. There seem to be so many more ways in which we can help restore a real, meaningful connection to nature for kids. And I'll talk about that maybe if there's a next round. But thanks for your great question.
There can be political tipping points, and there can be behavioral tipping points, and then there can be biological tipping points where, once, for example, forests start to grow back, it can happen very fast and very quickly with a modicum of protection. But behavioral tipping points, I mean, if you take, when I was a student, people used to drink and drive and think nothing of it. And they thought that if you put the police outside the pub, that was an infringement on the quotes. This was the 60s now. The quotes, the working man's right to go out and have a drink. It was, but I hope people don't think like. I think that people don't think like that anymore, and that's a change in understanding, a change in what we were collectively doing. And I think thinking through and taking examples of how these behavioural and political tipping points come about. If you think how quickly Ireland changed from really quite a repressive state into a country that legalised gay marriage very quickly. I mean, sometimes these political tipping points really happen. And to better understand those would I help, I think, in a part at least of your question.
Thank you very much for this discussion. I initially had a question following up on last night's conversation, but based on this, I came up with a new one, which kind of gets at the idea of the investment story seeming to be a more forward-looking, collaborative approach than the compensation story. I'm following that, and then the challenge I meet is the reality of the credit ratings or the financial systems, or the fact that many of the most exposed countries are heavily indebted. And so I'm wondering, there are some policy options that are being discussed, which, for example, debt for nature swaps. And I think I'm wondering for each of you, your perspectives on Professor Stern, like what opportunities do you see for an option like debt for nature swaps to scale within the framework of international financial architecture reform? Because I see there's a lot of challenges. And for Gretchen, if you see that as also a scalable way to channel finance into nature, and maybe for Simon, if you see this idea of reducing countries' debt burdens, some of which is attributable to climate change, if you see this kind of financial instrument playing a role in chipping away at this fairness principle.
Yeah, it's a very big development finance questions in there. A debt for nature swap would be something of the following kind, where here's a country which is paying, say, 8-9% on its debt, and an international institution can come in and say, we'll give you the money to pay off that debt, and you will pay us an interest rate of 3%, whatever it will be, but a big difference. So that country, in flow terms, is better off by that difference in the interest rates that are being paid. And the condition for doing that is you use a big chunk of that revenue to invest in nature. And as I've tried to describe it, that sounds like a very good idea, yeah? And because the international institutions can borrow on the capital markets at far lower rates than that particular country with all its risks and debts, then it's not, as it were, a gift in the sense that that international institution is losing money. It's not losing money, it's just replacing a debt which is deemed to be very risky with another one. And what you need for that is really the shareholders of those institutions just to get behind it. It's extremely cheap for the shareholders in those international institutions. So it's a good idea. But the more general point is that the kinds of investments we're talking about here are putting capital up front, call it a solar panel, in order to save on inputs down the track, call them gas or oil. So these are, in that sense, investments which are very focused on capital. So the cost of capital is critical. So the most important thing that we can do as a world is for these countries to, excuse me, it really isn't a cold, it's the blossom. Is to bring down the cost of capital. And for very small sums, our international institutions could do it. And actually, you don't need everybody to agree. I mean, here are 5 international institutions with 0 US shareholding. The European Investment Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank in Shanghai, the Islamic Development Bank, and CAF in Latin America. So that's an example where the coalition of people doing that is the people who happen to have the shareholding in those things. And it's not everybody. So you need, in Mark Carney's language, coalitions of the like-minded who are willing to do these things. So there's actually an awful lot we could do on the finance that's absolutely in our power to do.
I could play off that briefly.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
really good question, and fabulous response. And just to elevate what you said a moment before, that there are these tipping points in kind of political circles. And if we look at the international financial institutions as one political circle, they do seem to be at the cusp of a tipping point here. There are many individuals within them that have established natural capital labs, for instance, in the Asian Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. The World Bank is more widely distributed in how they address natural capital, but they've also really embraced this. And about 10 of these banks signed back in COP26, so like 5 years ago, a pledge to mainstream nature throughout their policies and activities. If we could get them fully on board in implementing that pledge, we'd go a really long way. And that's kind of the next top agenda item of the Natural Capital Alliance. And as part of that, just to bring it more to life than talking about these pledges or credit ratings and stuff, we've been working with the multilateral development banks to get cohorts of countries together who say, we really want to try this. So in this past couple of years, we had 16 countries with whom we worked over 16 months across all world regions, ranging in size from the Cook Islands up to China. And we implemented this, and the countries had to apply. The MDBs for their different regions agreed to support them in different ways, and then to try to scale anything successful that came out of it. And all the countries basically have had a success. And many have even changed policies, like the Philippines implemented a law to protect watersheds that they'd never had before, based on this one pretty little project, but it was part of a cohort and part of a movement that made it more significant than it might have looked just monetarily. And now we're entering a new round where this student I told couldn't speak here is helping to lead with the United Nations Development Program to do the same with a suite of countries. They have to apply to be part of this, and then the MDBs choose the most important for their portfolio and achieving whatever political change they want to achieve. So we are seeing this actually come about, and some countries, just to cite a really shining example in the first round, Chile got this idea of elevating a natural capital committee to work together with, bring together the Ministry of Economy, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Environment, and get those three to finally talk to one another, know one another, and coordinate. And that made all the other ministries really jealous and worried, and they subsequently joined. So this became actually a fantastic mechanism that for some years enabled Chile to kind of leapfrog ahead over other policy blockages. Now they're facing a change in government, but the current government has tried to really embed this, and actually a star supporter of it is at the LSE, Sofia Oroca, and she won one of our first Natural Capital Young Leaders Prizes. But it's just an example, and other countries are looking at doing the same thing, trying to shift the structure of government as yet another path to then make possible these real projects that can be seen on the ground and in the water by people, and greater security felt locally and near term in countries as a result of elevating the values of nature.
And the language of natural capital is very helpful there because, you know, I spent a few years working in a Ministry of Finance, and they all think that they're sort of jolly practical, you know, lads and lasses who are taking on these issues, and they don't get diverted by all this sort of tree-hugging nonsense. I exaggerate just a little bit.
I get it.
But if you talk about natural capital, if you talk about natural infrastructure, particularly the word infrastructure, these things, I mean, all the natural capital you're talking about is infrastructure in a very reasonable use of the word. It enables and it protects other activities. Yeah? That's exactly what it does. And if the Ministries of Finance can understand it in that way, you're actually using their own language. I mean, it's not always that you use that language to understand the things you're trying to get at. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But if you're trying to persuade people whose job it is to do that kind of bean counting, then it helps, I think, to use the language of infrastructure and capital.
I did have a question, and so I don't know the empirics, and I guess my one question is, are there any losers in this situation? So are there cases where people take on a debt for nature kind of plan, and some people are disadvantaged by this? Maybe they're prohibited from doing things they would otherwise be able to do.
Exactly.
And so, you know, if you're political philosophy, you see distributive questions everywhere. So I just wondered whether everyone benefits, or some people might be told, oh, you were thinking of using this bit of land for crops, but no, it's for afforestation for our nature debt swap. So this may be a fictional worry, but if not, then I suppose I think it's worth thinking about questions of distributive fairness in these cases.
With that question hanging in the air, I notice we have 5 more minutes and 3 more questioners.
Okay.
I wonder if we could just take the 3 questions together, and then you can respond to whatever you like. Could you please keep your questions brief?
Thank you very much. Yesterday, Professor, you mentioned issues of framing, of urgency, and also directing investments in ways that could move the needle. I teach systems innovation with a methodology called systems acupuncture. And what I find is that even when you try to think outside the box, you just think in a bigger box. And it's still a box. And so the question is, to what extent, given that if our institutions, the current institutions that are culpable for having created the Anthropocene, the mechanics of the Anthropocene that is degrading the quality of the integrity of the planetary systems that underpin the safe operating systems for civilization, to what extent is the innovation or the systems lens directed towards what technology or just which party can do what, but can we take it on simultaneously at the practical level, saying that the clock tick of change needs to be as fast as we need it to be, at the same time as addressing the ontological and the epistemic failure in our institutional systems in order to direct innovation capacity towards creating new models.
Yeah, thanks so much for this. I'd like to push a little harder on something Gretchen has raised a few times in her very characteristically understated way. But one of the amazing things about natural capital is that it has seemed to fit in very nicely to what economists already do, and it fits very well into what moral philosophers do, and it's quantified things in a way that is useful for other disciplines. But the second part of what Gretchen's work and the broader ecosystem of this work has done has been to elevate this point that she keeps making about just wonder at the natural world. And most of us didn't get into this to, help put nature on the balance sheet for economists and to help figure out how moral philosophers should think about nature. We got into this because our planet is amazing. And I keep hearing her say this over and over, and I would like to know how to bring that wonder and really the uncertainty that underpins that wonder into economics and into moral philosophy itself.
Question.
Thank you so much. And kind of bouncing off of the question that the gentleman before me raised, given that today you highlighted shifting your framing from from compensating to making investments. As a second-year undergraduate student in business and mathematics, I was curious as to how you really calculate or convince people that it is less of a burden and more of an opportunity for them to invest in the future, especially when there seems to be no set algorithm to calculate both the risks of making this investment and as well as the risks of not making that investment, especially when you want to take into all these factors of nature and also the monetary returns.
Yeah.
So perhaps if you could have a minute on any of those thoughts, just a last thought, we'll have time to close it out. Simon, would you like to start? And then
Honestly,
Not exactly.
I'd like to comment on the question about wonder, because I'm sure it's absolutely right. And I'd like not to be, but I can't help but be a bit pessimistic about it. And I was thinking about the social theory of Max Weber, talking the disenchantment of the world. And it does seem that there are many forces that call for disenchantment. And I don't know if it's the economic systems or the prevalence of technology, but I do think we're swimming against a tide, and I wish I could think of something to address that. Having walked around the campus the last couple of days, I do think people just doing it actually. So I think people's attitudes and beliefs and desires are shaped profoundly by what's around them. And I think it's hard to wander around here and not get a sense of awe and wonder. So if there's a chicken and egg problem, I think if enough people do this and create this and build towns and cities in ways that foreground the natural world and don't obscure it from vision, then the better chance we have. I wish I had a better answer, because I think it's a fundamentally important question.
I'll try to go quickly so you get the good closing remark here, but I share your worry for sure, and I'll just give one possible path, and that would be to focus on schools. It would help address the justice issues. All schools should have a minimum of this much nature around them. There's a ton of data to show the benefits from a performance standpoint and many different levels, and academic through to mental health. With such mental health crises around here, many families feel this acutely with their kids. And many cities feel the lack of nature acutely with the oncoming heating and things like that. And just investing in trees and other elements of nature around schools has been shown to be so powerful in terms of benefit, and at the same time might help propel all kinds of communities toward deeper understanding. And it's a small initial step, but one that could maybe be sold by a person like you.
Okay. Look, it is taking the wonder question first. If two or three arguments point the same way, then good. We mustn't be forced to choose between which argument to use. They're all good arguments. I mean, the idea that it's good for who we are and our sense of individualism, our sense of community, the spiritual side of life, it's tremendous for that. It fits with what makes sense in terms of wise investments economically, in terms of a productive and secure future. And we should use those arguments together. It's not that, by pushing the economics argument because the finance ministries have the money and I've got a bit of an understanding how they work, so I try to use language which they respond to. It's also using those other arguments. They might not fly so strongly in ministries of finance, but they can fly in the population as a whole. And there's a politics here to all that. I mean, one good example of somebody who does put this together rather well is David Attenborough. And And he's very British and all that, and a national treasurer, but you probably know who he is. And he does that brilliantly well. He's 100 in May, and he still does it. So all his programs are about the magic and the wonder. But as he's got older, he's got more and more purposive about what to do, and he asks the what to do question. And he doesn't expect to answer them all, but he pushes it and helps along the momentum in others like we on the platform here who are trying to do it. On the whole systems approach, I mean, it must be right. You've got these very big systems. I emphasized cities and energy and transport and land and water. And of course, they integrate into a big system. You've got a systemic approach to economic policy. What kind of strategies do you follow? And I've tried to give a big picture answer to where we need to go, but about structural change, systems change, redesigning our cities, our energy, and our transport system through investment. But there are lots of bits within that, and that's really relevant to the last question about investment and risk. It's the job of public policy, it seems to me, to have a big picture of where we need to go, founded on realistic, hard analysis, and then be able to understand the details. Now, most of this is going to be driven by private sector investment. We've heard lots of things which won't be entirely driven by private sector investment, but lots of it's driven by private sector investment. They worry about risk and cost and confidence in revenues. If you invest in renewable energy, and it's not just on your house, you're wanting to sell it into the grid, as perhaps on scale, you need to be confident that the institution that's buying that energy will actually pay you on time and reliably and so on. So reforming those institutional structures are an example of something within this big system, which is quite itself big in its own right, which enables other people to do the investment. So what we're not doing here is abandoning the market economy. We're actually stopping it being destructive by incentivizing investments in different areas. And we got where we are because the market economy didn't take into account all the things that Gretchen and we have been emphasizing, that people making economic policy didn't recognize the many market failures. I listed 6 yesterday that within all this. But if you have a much better view of where you're trying to go, and then you have policies which make it profitable and less risky to do the kinds of things we've described, then that's where investment will go. But it won't go there without that big view of the strategic direction, and it won't go there without the institutional reforms, for example, the electricity company that's got to be reliable, and it won't go there without the right kind of taxes and prices. But broadly speaking, we know enough to get on with it. We don't know everything, and we'll learn along the way. But we know enough to really go after it now.
Before we thank our speakers, let me just mention that Nick's slides are available on the Ethics Center website. His most excellent book, Growth in the 21st Century, is available for free on the LSE Books website and on his website. The video for all of the event, last night and tonight, will be available on the Ethics Center website in a couple of weeks. We should thank our discussants, Simon Caney, Gretchen Daly, and last night Heather Boucher, for their incisive and illuminating and inspiring comments. And about Nicholas Stern, I was reminded in 1940, Winston Churchill said after the Battle of Britain, "Never has so much been owed by so many to so few." I think we can say about Nicholas Stern, never has so much been explained so clearly to so many. Let's thank Nick and our discussants for showing us that. And let's enjoy nature.
Okay.